May 8, 1945. The war in Europe is over. Not with a bang, with paperwork. Signed at 2:41 in the morning in a schoolhouse in Reims, France. The cameras were there. The generals shook hands. 7 million American soldiers looked up from their positions and asked the same question. Now what? 20 miles north of Frankfurt, in a town called Cronenberg, a U.S. Army checkpoint sat at the edge of what used to be a neighborhood. The walls were still standing, some of them. A kitchen on the second floor, open to the sky, the pot still hanging on its hook. A girl walked out of the rubble, 7 years old, maybe 8. She held out both hands. The soldier at that checkpoint had a Hershey bar in his pocket. He'd been saving it since Tuesday. His sergeant said, "Don't." By afternoon, General George S. Patton had heard what happened. What he said, and what he did, has never made it into a single textbook. But among the men who were there, it never stopped being repeated. The Germans had a word for it. Stunde Null, 0 hour. The moment the clock resets. The moment everything before stops counting, and everything after hasn't started yet. May 1945 was that moment, and it looked nothing like victory. 12 million Germans were on the road, not driving, walking. Refugees, displaced workers, prisoners released from camps, soldiers who'd surrendered and been told to go home. Except home, for most of them, was a foundation and a chimney. The walls were somewhere in the rubble. In the cities, the numbers were brutal. The average civilian caloric intake in occupied German cities that spring was somewhere between 400 and 800 calories per day. You need roughly 2,000 to function. At 400 calories, your body starts consuming itself. Children are the first to show it. The swollen joints, the discolored skin, the eyes that stop moving the way eyes are supposed to move. Tony Judt, in his History of Post-War Europe, documented what the occupying forces found. In some districts, the food situation among German civilians in the months following surrender was worse than recorded levels inside certain concentration camps prior to liberation. This wasn't a secret. The American commanders knew. The British knew. The Soviet zone was worse. Everyone knew. The question nobody had a clean answer to was, whose problem is this? These were the people who'd supported the regime, voted for it, or looked away from it, or both. Their children had worn uniforms with eagles on them. Their fathers had built the war machine that killed 100,000 American boys, and now they were hungry. At the checkpoints, American soldiers stood between two facts that refused to fit together. The military order said, no fraternization, no gifts, no contact beyond what operational necessity required. The penalty was a $65 fine, roughly half a month's pay for an enlisted man. The other fact was standing right in front of them, 7 years old, holding out both hands, not speaking. She didn't need to. That gesture is older than any language, older than any war. The soldiers knew exactly what it meant. Some of them turned away. Some of them didn't. And somewhere up the chain of command, the reports were starting to land on desks. Officers were writing memos. The memos were asking questions that nobody had prepared a policy answer for. The war had taken 4 years to win. Nobody had spent 4 years planning what happened next. The order had a name, Non-Fraternization Policy, issued by SHAEF, Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, in the spring of 1945, signed off by Eisenhower, distributed down to every battalion, every company, every squad. The language was precise. No friendly contact with German civilians, no shaking hands, no gifts, no shared meals. No conversation beyond what military operations required. $65 for a violation, half a month's pay. The reasoning was sound, on paper. Germany had not simply lost a war. It had built a machine designed to exterminate human beings at industrial scale. The people who built that machine, who ran it, who supplied it, who looked away from it, they were still here. Still in these towns, still in these houses with the half-standing walls. Trust was not on the table. But the soldiers who received that order were 22 years old, 23, They'd grown up in Ohio and Georgia and rural Pennsylvania. They'd been trained to identify a fighting position, to clear a room, to treat a gunshot wound. Nobody had trained them for this. In the summer of 1945, Stars and Stripes, the U.S. military's own newspaper, published letters from soldiers in the field. The debate ran for weeks. One soldier wrote, "These people started this war. Every kindness we show is a kindness they didn't earn." Another wrote, "I know how to kill a man. 3 years of practice, but nobody told me what I'm supposed to do when a child is starving in front of me. The manual doesn't cover that." Both letters were real. Both men were right from where they were standing. That's what made it impossible. The non-fraternization order began breaking down almost immediately, not through any official revision, through friction, the daily, grinding friction of human beings standing in front of other human beings and being told those other human beings don't count. Soldiers found workarounds. Leave a ration tin on a wall. Walk away. Don't watch what happens next. If you don't hand it over directly, it isn't a violation. Not technically. The checkpoints developed their own unwritten rules. Turn your back. What's in your pocket isn't your pocket's business. None of this was in any manual. None of it was authorized. None of it stopped. By June, senior officers were sending memos up the chain. The policy as written was not holding. Something had to give, the order or the men following it. What nobody expected was that the loudest voice on the question would come from a general who had built his entire reputation on not giving an inch. Let's be clear about who George Patton was. Not the movie version. Not the man standing in front of a flag giving a speech that became one of the most quoted openings in Hollywood history. That version is real enough. Patton did speak like that, did think like that, did slap a soldier in a hospital and nearly ended his own career over it. But there's another version, the one in the diaries. Martin Blumenson spent years editing the Patton Papers, 2 volumes, primary sources, the actual letters and diary entries Patton wrote in his own hand. What emerges from those pages is not the simple portrait of a warrior who only understood force. By the summer of 1945, Patton was Military Governor of Bavaria. His job was occupation, the hardest job in any war, because it starts the day the shooting stops and nobody trains you for it. He was watching the denazification process, watching the policy, watching what happened at the checkpoints, in the towns, in the displaced persons camps scattered across the rubble. And he was writing it down. In his diary, Patton recorded his growing frustration. The denazification directives, he believed, were being applied indiscriminately, punishing people based on membership records rather than actual conduct. He wrote that they were replacing experienced administrators with people who had no ability to keep basic services running: water, food distribution, medical care. He wasn't arguing for sympathy toward war criminals. He was arguing that you cannot govern Rubble with ideology. Whether you agree with his analysis or not, the logic was cold and specific. A starving, ungoverned German population was a security problem. A disease outbreak in a collapsed city didn't check for nationality before spreading. Chaos on the western side of Germany had a very specific eastern neighbor waiting to fill it. Patton could see 1946 and 1947 from where he was standing in 1945. Most of Washington couldn't. Then came September 22nd, a press conference. A reporter asked Patton why more Nazis weren't being removed from administrative positions in Bavaria. Patton's answer was not diplomatic. He said the Nazi Party was just like a Democratic-Republican fight back home. People had joined it for political reasons, not necessarily out of conviction. The room went quiet. By the next morning, the wire services had the quote. By the afternoon, the calls were coming into Eisenhower's office. Eisenhower had defended Patton before, through the slapping incident, through every controversy. He understood what Patton was and what Patton was worth on a battlefield. But this wasn't a battlefield. On October 7, 1945, Eisenhower relieved Patton of command of the Third Army. No battle, no enemy, removed by his own side, in a country that had already surrendered, because he had said out loud what a lot of people in the occupation were privately thinking. What Patton understood, and what got him fired, was that winning the war and managing the peace were not the same skill. The qualities that made him exceptional at one made him dangerous at the other. He moved fast, spoke without calculation, forced decisions. In combat, those were assets. In occupation, they were liabilities. He was replaced by a man who understood paperwork. The irony is brutal. Patton saw the humanitarian crisis in the occupation zones more clearly than most. He just couldn't talk about it without setting off a political fire that neither he nor Eisenhower could control. He never got another command. 2 months later, on December 9th, a car accident outside Mannheim. He died 12 days after that. The man who had driven further, faster, with less sleep than almost any commander in the war, killed in a minor collision on a road in peacetime Germany at 30 miles an hour. Nobody announced the change. There was no revised order, no memo from Eisenhower's office walking back the non-fraternization policy, no press conference, no official acknowledgement that the thing wasn't working. It just stopped holding. The way ice doesn't crack all at once. It thins. Then one morning you put your weight on it and your foot goes through. The Veterans History Project at the Library of Congress holds thousands of recorded testimonies from American soldiers who served in the occupation. Read enough of them, and a pattern emerges. Not the dramatic stories, the quiet ones. The ones where the soldier pauses mid-sentence and says something like, "I know we weren't supposed to, but..." A ration tin left on a wall, a chocolate bar placed on a windowsill, a soldier who needed to check something on the other side of a checkpoint and happened to leave his jacket on a fence post, and there happened to be something in the pocket. None of it was dramatic. That's the point. These weren't acts of political defiance. They weren't statements about occupation policy or the moral complexities of denazification. They were just men, 22, 23 years old, who had been standing in one place long enough to watch the same children walk past every day, and who eventually reached a limit that no military order had anticipated. The limit wasn't ideology. It was repetition. By late summer 1945, the non-fraternization policy was being quietly, selectively revised. In June, soldiers were permitted to speak to German children. In July, certain restrictions on adult contact were loosened. The $65 fine didn't disappear, but enforcement became inconsistent, then sparse, then mostly theoretical. The official history describes this as a phased revision based on evolving occupation conditions. The men on the ground had a different description. One veteran, interviewed decades later, put it this way: "The order said don't, but the order wasn't standing where I was standing." 3 years after this, 1948, Berlin. The Soviets have blockaded the city. American aircraft are flying supplies in around the clock. A pilot named Gail Halverson starts attaching candy bars to handkerchiefs and dropping them from his plane for the children waiting below. The press calls him the Candy Bomber. He becomes one of the most celebrated Americans in post-war Germany. What he was doing in 1948, from an airplane, at official scale with cameras watching, was the same thing a soldier at a checkpoint had done in 1945, alone, with his back turned, hoping nobody wrote it down. The difference wasn't the act, it was whether the war was still embarrassed by it. Here's what the United States decided. Not in a single meeting, not with one signature. It took arguments, reversals, competing factions inside the State Department, and a Secretary of State who had commanded armies and understood what happens to a country when its infrastructure collapses completely. George Marshall had seen occupied Germany. He understood the arithmetic. A devastated, ungoverned, starving Germany in the center of Europe was not a stable outcome. It was an invitation. The Soviet Union was already consolidating its zone. The ideological contest for the post-war world was not waiting for the dust to settle. In June 1947, Marshall stood at a podium at Harvard University and outlined what would become the European Recovery Program. $16 billion, directed at rebuilding the economies of European nations, including, explicitly, the former enemy, including Germany. The political opposition in Washington was immediate. These were the people who had built the camps, who had killed American soldiers, who had systematically murdered 11 million civilians, and the proposal was to give them money? Marshall's position was not sentimental. It was structural. He said, "A Europe full of hungry, unstable nations is a Europe that cannot buy American goods, cannot maintain democratic governments, and cannot resist Soviet expansion. This isn't charity, it's architecture." Congress passed it. What followed was one of the more remarkable outcomes in the history of modern warfare. West Germany, the country that 8 years earlier had been the engine of the most destructive war in human history, became, within a decade, one of the most stable democracies and strongest economies in Europe. The Germans called it the Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle. It was not a miracle. It was a choice, made by people who looked at the rubble and decided that punishment had a ceiling, and past that ceiling, it became something else entirely. The soldier at the checkpoint in 1945 didn't know any of this. He didn't know about Marshall, didn't know about the recovery program, didn't know that the question he was standing inside, do you extend a hand to someone your country just spent 4 years trying to kill, was going to be answered at the policy level 2 years later with $16 billion. He just knew what was in his pocket, and he knew what was standing in front of him. The distance between those two things, a chocolate bar and a Marshall Plan, is not as large as it looks. Both were answers to the same question. What do you do with the people you've defeated? We don't know what the soldier did. That's not a failure of research. It's the nature of the historical record. The men at those checkpoints, the ones who stood there with something in their pockets and a child in front of them, most of them didn't write memoirs, didn't give interviews, went home to Ohio and Georgia and rural Pennsylvania and didn't talk about it much. What they did or didn't do in that moment didn't make the official record. It made them. Patton died on December 21, 1945, 12 days after the accident outside Mannheim. He never saw the Marshall Plan, never saw what West Germany became, never saw Gail Halvorsen drop candy from an airplane over Berlin while cameras rolled and the whole world watched and called it a symbol of American generosity. He would have had something to say about that. He always did. Eisenhower went on to become president. The occupation policies he oversaw, the ones Patton had argued about, the ones the soldiers had quietly broken, the ones that eventually bent towards something more human, those policies became the template. Not just for Germany, for how a victor talks to a defeated country when the guns go quiet. It doesn't always work. History has enough examples of what happens when it doesn't. But in 1945, in the specific geography of a continent trying to remember what peace looked like, someone made a calculation. Maybe it was a soldier at a checkpoint. Maybe it was a general signing a policy revision. Maybe it was a Secretary of State standing at a Harvard podium. The calculation was this: the war is over. The enemy is gone. What's left is people. And people, even people on the wrong side of a catastrophic history, get hungry. That girl who walked out of the rubble in Cronenberg, 7 years old, hands out. If she survived that winter, the hunger, the cold, the disease that moved through the displaced population like a second war, she would be in her late 80s now. She doesn't know she's in this story. She doesn't know that the moment she walked toward a soldier with her hands out became, in some small way, a hinge point. Not a famous one, not the kind that ends up in textbooks, the kind that ends up in a man's memory, decades later, when someone asks him what the war was really like, and he pauses and says, "There was this kid." The question he faced that day has never gone away. Every war ends. And every time it ends, someone is standing at a checkpoint with something in their pocket, looking at the people they just defeated. What happens next is not decided by generals. It's decided right there,